Good morning. My name is Silke Caparelli. I work here in the Patent Pittsburgh office. We are so thrilled to be having today. We thank you for braving the elements to get here. We'll be working today from 8:30 to 11:45. If you haven't already signed in or have your materials, please do so outside. Without further delay, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Tim Runge. He's here with us today from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Runge has been an avid supporter of the Pennsylvania patent system and other research or related tasks that he helps PDE and the Bureau of Special Ed attend to, specifically in the area of multi-tiered systems of support, PBIS, and keeping up with a lot of the outside data tasks that are needed. So I'm going to let Dr. Runge tell you a little bit more about himself. We are recording today's session. While the other two offices have delays, we are recording this so that we can, there's others that will watch on the other side of this when they don't have inclement weather. Harrisburg and the East is shut down right now. So that means that when we have a question, I'm going to bring the microphone to you. So I want you to be really brave and courageous and take the mic and speak into the mic. That way we can all hear the question and Dr. Runge does not have to repeat the question. He can just answer it and move on. Any questions? Excellent. Welcome. Make yourselves at home. Dr. Runge.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for braving the elements to be here today. I understand that we're a little thin on the number of people that were originally scheduled to be here in this office. So you all get the gold stars for showing up not only on a Friday, but also given the inclement weather. So thank you. And hopefully everybody else is still traveling safely and maybe we'll be arriving a little bit later. And we apologize that Harrisburg and East are not going to be able to join us, but as Silke had indicated, this is being recorded so that your parents can view the video later on that has your voice on it, and they can send you emails. Hey, I just heard you on a patent video. Now, hopefully they aren't doing that. I know that actually has happened to me a few times, which is really embarrassing when my mom says, hey, you were doing a training somewhere. So anyhow, a little bit more about myself, not to go into too much detail because you didn't necessarily come here to learn about me. Hopefully you came here because you want to learn more about ROI practices, particularly in the utilization of them for specific learning disability determination. But as Silke had indicated, my name is Tim Runge. I am a faculty member in an educational school psychology department at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, IUP. I've been there this is my 10th year. And prior to that, I worked for the Patent Harrisburg office for 2.5 years. So that was a lifetime ago, it seems like. I also was a practitioner. I was a school psychologist for approximately 8.5 years. In a very rural school district in central Pennsylvania, Mifflin County School District, which is IU11. Most people have never heard of Mifflin County, but it is approximately halfway between State College and Harrisburg. And so I was a practitioner as a school psychologist in that district for, as I indicated, about 8.5 years. So as a consequence, the disclosure here is that I am a school psychologist by training and trade. And to some, hopefully that's a good thing. To others, maybe that's a scary thing. But in reality, or maybe how this applies to this particular content, is that I have been working on ROI and SLD determinations as a practitioner, as a patent consultant, and now more recently in the last 10 years as a trainer, but also as a researcher in these particular areas. So hopefully I bring some relevance and some credibility, but that's for you to judge whether that is relevant or credible. So I'm just curious as to the individuals that are here, and everybody is so far away, it's a little odd for me, but that's okay. I'm just curious as to what professionals we have in the audience, so basically I know what I'm up against. So teachers, anybody is a teacher? All right, general ed or special ed teacher, or both? Special ed, all right. Thank you, good for you all to be here. Administrators. Building level or central office?
I'm an MTSS coordinator for an elementary school.
MTSS coordinator for an elementary school. Fantastic. Okay, so we have teachers, we have administrators, school psychologists. One. All right, we're kindred spirits. Fantastic. Other support staff like SLPs, speech and language pathologists, OTs, PTs, or SLPs. All right. Parents. Nobody in this room has a child. I mean, it's possible, but Okay, all right, and consultants, IU TAC consultants. I knew I was missing a major piece there. Okay, anybody who just happened to wander in off the street, they had nothing better to do, or they were stranded in Western Pennsylvania because of our ice and snow? Apparently not. Who am I missing? I think I got everybody's hands raised, so that's good. All right, so that's good for me to understand who the audience is. I'd also like to know a little bit about your familiarity with MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. And just a very quick, non-empirical assessment, but based on some self-reported data, I'm just curious about your level of familiarity with MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, for service delivery. I take MTSS and kind of think about them in two separate ways. One way is MTSS for delivery of instruction and supports. So we're not talking eligibility for special ed. We're just talking about what's good practice for kids and what's helpful for the adults in the buildings. So on a scale of 1 to 5, I would like you to self-evaluate your own awareness of MTSS for service delivery, with 1 being you've barely heard of MTSS, 5 meaning you have a great deal of familiarity, and clearly we at least have 1 audience member who I'm hoping, given your self-reported role, is near a 5. What is your level of familiarity? So I'm gonna let you think about it for about 3 seconds, and then I'll cue you. On 3, I need everybody to give me an indication between 1 and 5. If you select 1, just please choose your digit wisely. All right? So 1, 2, 3. Your level of familiarity for service delivery. So you got 2s, 3. So it's approximately on average, thank you all. Thank you for group participation. It's on average about 2.78, I think is what I calculated. So we're right in the middle. That's good. That is helpful because one of the assumptions of this workshop is that you have at least some familiarity with MTSS for service delivery. I noted just a few moments ago that I kind of think of MTSS in 2 different ways. Service delivery, which we just reviewed in terms of your familiarity. Then I also think of MTSS in terms of a process for identification of special education need. In my mind, that is a different kind of understanding of MTSS. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you again to self-assess, 1 to 5, your familiarity of the process of using MTSS instruction, assessment, data decision-making processes in order to determine eligibility for special ed. So again, 1 to 5, let me count up to 3 and please indicate your level of familiarity. 1, 2, 3. All right, so we're a little bit lower than what we previously had. So remember, before it was 2.78 on average. Now I think we're on a 2.27. So we're a little bit lower in terms of the overall audience, and that's good because the focus of today's content is largely going to be on helping you all as a group to move from an average of 2.27 on the MTSS for eligibility decision making, move that up. Again, the content for today largely assumes that you have a decent understanding of MTSS service delivery, and the hope is that you build off of that today in a way that makes you more efficient, more effective at understanding how you can use MTSS for eligibility decision making. And what I am particularly thrilled to see is that we don't just have school psychologists in the audience, even though kindred spirit, I feel much at home when school psychs are in the audience, but if we all remember, the whole eligibility determination process is not made by one professional in a school. It is made by a collective team, including regular ed, special ed, administrators, consultants, support staff, and most importantly, parents. So the hope is that today you will benefit. If I'm doing my job well, you all should hopefully benefit from gaining a deeper understanding of how to use MTSS for eligibility decision making, particularly for the disability category of specific learning disability, or SLD. All right, so that gets us started, and again, I appreciate you offering up your perspectives on familiarity with MTSS for service delivery, as well as MTSS for eligibility decision-making for specific learning disability. Because again, that latter piece is the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so I got to get this to work. And neither one of these is advancing. There we go, it's this one. I have too many clickers, so there we go. So just as a reminder, the patent mission is to support all students, but clearly its mission since its inception was to focus on the needs of students with disabilities. But as I'm sure many, if not most of you are well aware, patent is also motivated by, and so are its IUs, at supporting all students in their least restrictive environment. And from my perspective, MTSS is a great way to support the needs of all students, whether they have a disability, are thought to have a disability, or are developing typically, that the patent IU and school systems have at heart providing services to all students, regardless of disability or disability status. And so MTSS, again, in my view, provides a great framework to do that, and that's the MTSS for service delivery kind of mindset that I bring to this conversation. All right, if I'm doing my job well, and you all will be the judge of that, then our goals for today are articulated on this particular slide. First, want to make sure that everybody has a basic understanding of MTSS service delivery, and that's not necessarily specifically identified as one of these 4 outcomes, but you will note in the initial slides that's really the focus. Once we do that, then we dive much more deeply into MTSS for eligibility decision making, with particular emphasis on establishing level, as well as establishing rate of improvement, and whether or not level and rate of improvement data are supportive of a student who might be thought of or is in fact believed to have a disability. So we're going to talk about the theoretical understandings of ROI, how it's physically calculated, and thankfully in this modern day and age we have most of the commercially available products that schools are encouraged to use are already calculating those data for you, but we're going to talk about them. And then focus on how we can use ROI, or rate of improvement trajectories, to try to estimate how long is it going to take for an individual to catch up to typically developing peers. Because that really is the crux of MTSS for eligibility decision making is, this student is progressing at a particular rate. How long is it going to take for that student to catch up? And is that length of time sustainable given the current levels of supports and services offered to that student? Which is those are tough questions, but those are important questions that happen at the local level. And then we will do all of this within the context of how to memorialize all of these data and these processes in an evaluation report. Because again, as many, if not all of you are well aware, the end result of the evaluation for eligibility determination is an ER, or an evaluation report, that is written collectively by a team, not just the school psych, not just the support staff or whomever. It is collectively authored by the multidisciplinary team, and so we have an illustration of what that might look like in the framework of using MTSS for eligibility decision making. To that end, in the materials that you picked up today, you should have a copy of the PowerPoint. There are just a few very minor deviations to it from what you have as to what you'll see, and it's frankly because I noticed a few page differences as I was reviewing this content 2 days ago, and so, but largely speaking, the content remains the same. You should also have a copy of a sample ER evaluation report. It is a sample only. We are not suggesting that everybody use this as a template or as an exemplar per se, but we feel as though it carries all of the characteristics of a good ER that uses and documents data relative to eligibility decision making for SLD using MTSS logic. And then you have a few other handouts for Act 48, as well as some guiding questions related to discussions that we hope you all would have with your peers either here or back in your school districts. Just by judging how everybody is seated, because there's plenty of space, and so I'm imagining if you're sitting really close to folks, that's probably people with whom you work. But I'm also gaining the sense that we have a few folks here who are maybe the only representative of their particular agency. Please understand that there will be opportunities for group conversations, relatively brief because we do only have 3 hours today, but there will be opportunities to have conversations amongst your peers to talk about how does this look, or what does this look like back in your district. If you are by yourself, thank you for being here, being the lone wolf, but you may want to consider either talking to yourself, maybe in your head, not necessarily out loud, but maybe even consider pairing up with someone nearby you who looks like he or she does not necessarily have a friend that they came with. So it might give you some ideas as to what other agencies, what other LEAs or IUs are doing. So I will also be sensitive to folks' needs and having at least one brief break about halfway through. And we do have a couple of times at which point I will be directing you to dive into the evaluation report and do some reading. And we're going to be reflecting on some of the content that we see in the ER. So there will be opportunities for a little bit of group work, opportunities for breaks, but if you have to get up because you need to stretch your legs or for whatever reason, please do so. And lastly, I should I have to remind myself out loud and also let you know, because we are recording, I'm kind of wedded to this this podium, which presents a little bit of a challenge for me because I like to move around, and so and I didn't bring my collar to zap me if I move outside of the invisible fence, but I am going to be kind of stuck here. So you all being far away, we're just going to have to manage, and that'll work. Okay, so diving into MTSS for service delivery. That is largely what I wanted to review briefly here in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And again, since we had on average about a 2.78 familiarity across the room with MTSS for service delivery, some of this ought to be a repetition for you, but repetition is good. So what we already know is that within an MTSS service delivery framework, rate of improvement, ROI, is one of the key indicators of success for a student who is involved in tiered supports. And that ROI, in addition to their current level of proficiency, and level is different than ROI, that level is also important for decision making in terms of intensification or scaling back of tiered supports. And that logic has to be embedded within everybody's thinking for an MTSS service delivery model. It can't just be the logic that is used by a multidisciplinary team for eligibility decision making. It has to be just the standard operating procedure for MTSS service delivery. Those data are conceptualized within a problem-solving framework. And briefly, problem-solving framework is essentially identify the problem, collect some data on it, gather some hypotheses about how to fix that problem, implement those strategies, monitor efficacy, and then make decisions about efficacy of that particular intervention or supports. And so that logic is used in a cyclical fashion by all teams to establish whether or not tiered supports are adequate, are sufficient, but that same logic is also used by multidisciplinary teams when evaluating for special education eligibility. The benefit of ROI and contemporary technologies is that most of the manual aspect of ROI, that is the math, is already done for us by most commercially available products. So if you are math averse, don't worry about it because the ROIs are typically done for us by the products that many school districts are using. So when do we evaluate response to intervention, RTI? Two purposes or utilizations of RTI. The first is, again, that MTSS for service delivery that I was discussing. That is, we're looking at RTI responsiveness or lack thereof to intervention as part of our decision making within service delivery and kids moving amongst the tiers. That's MTSS for service delivery. The second point, and again, the focus of at least 2/3 of today's workshop, is on how we use RTI logic for eligibility decision making. That's MTSS for special education identification. So what are some of the basics of MTSS for service delivery? Please understand that I am not suggesting that the content on these next few slides is adequate coverage of what MTSS is for service delivery. That is at least a couple of days worth of content and deep discussion about MTSS for service delivery. So I want to just say up front that what I have on these next few slides is not intended to be an exhaustive or comprehensive review of MTSS for service delivery. But we have intentionally highlighted some of the key points, as well as those key points that directly relate to using MTSS for eligibility decision making. So at Tier 1, not surprisingly for most, if not all of you, we have to have a core instructional diet that is aligned to the Pennsylvania standards. And that is true for all academic areas, not just reading, not just math, not just language arts, but that is all of our content. We also must have a fully functioning universal screening process in place at least 3 times a year, using highly reliable and valid screeners. Good news on that one is you have lots of options of commercially available products that have great psychometric qualities. In other words, they're highly reliable and highly valid for their intended use. So not only do you have screeners, but you also have progress monitoring processes and data analysis teams in place that are efficiently and effectively and regularly reviewing data. And that we have not only that core instruction at Tier 1, but in Tiers 2 and 3, we have a large menu of evidence-based practices and standard protocols that can specifically address students' particular skill deficits. It's not just that a school has only one Tier 1 reading program, or excuse me, Tier 2 program or intervention. If you only have one Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention protocol available for all of your students, you're probably not doing MTSS, the whole service delivery logic, very well, because you will undoubtedly have kids who have different skill deficits that require different interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3. So you need to have a wide menu of available evidence-based interventions, practices at Tiers 2 and Tier 3. And then lastly, and notably, you must have family engagement throughout this whole process. In fact, a very recent federal court case in Colorado clearly indicates that families must be involved throughout the MTSS process, particularly if you go to an eligibility decision-making framework. Parents, if they are not involved in the tiered process, they can, and the federal court in Colorado, federal district court in Colorado upheld against the district that because the family was not involved in the tiered process, their child was denied FAPE because parents were not involved in that tiered process for service delivery. And as a consequence, that district was held to compensatory education for the student because parents had not been adequately involved in the tiered process prior to a decision-making team meeting regarding eligibility. So this cannot be underemphasized enough, and that is, we must have parents involved in the tiered discussion of services well before we get to the point of deciding whether or not a kid has a disability. So please make sure you're involving parents. Okay, so very specifically at Tier 1, again, we have to make sure that all of our practices are aligned with Pennsylvania standards, that we have a menu of Tier 1 supports and accommodations that can be applied to small groups of students within the core curriculum that is matched to their particular need, and that we have direct, explicit instruction in specific skills for reading, writing, and mathematics minimally. So the obvious one, or the obvious illustration was, you better have a reading curriculum at the elementary grades that focuses on the big 5 ideas in reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. If your core instruction is not addressing each of those 5 big ideas in reading, you're not meeting one of the fundamental assumptions of MTSS for not only service delivery, but you will be challenged with regard to using MTSS for special education eligibility as well if you don't have evidence-based core instruction that addresses the very specific skills in each of these domains. You also need to make sure that you have data that supports that the core instruction is being implemented with integrity. This is not just necessarily a random number that is put onto this slide suggesting that 80% of all kids should be meeting triannual benchmarks. We have lots of studies over the past, at least 20 years. It's almost 30 years now that I think about it. It is 2018. We have almost 30 years worth of evidence that clearly indicates that if schools are implementing evidence-based core instruction with integrity, even in communities that have low SES, high levels of diversity, high levels of challenges in communities, that they can still get 80% of kids reading at benchmark 3 times a year as assessed on those triannual measures. So the point here is that if you are looking at universal screening data and you're at 30 or 40% of kids meeting benchmark, there's a problem at tier 1. This is not a special ed problem. This is not a tier 3 problem. This isn't even a tier 2 problem. This is a problem of the core instruction. And I'm not suggesting it's a problem with the teachers, because teachers don't need to be the scapegoats. This is a challenge that is system-wide. So it could be the curriculum, it could be the delivery of instruction, it could be your grouping, it could be all sorts of things. Notice most of those are not necessarily pointing fingers at teachers, because frankly we have to look at the whole system and the health of the system if we are not achieving 80% proficiency on triannual benchmarks. As I noted just a few moments ago, we have to have a variety of options at tier 1 that provide supplemental supports for all kids, typically provided in some small groupings within a class or across groups. That all must be part of tier 1. And then layered on top of that, of course, is universal screening and effective, regularly scheduled data analysis teaming at grade levels or at the secondary level. We would tend to gravitate more toward discipline or content-specific data analysis teams. So my colleague Joe Kowaleski and I are working with some high schools, and they tend to break down at the high school level in terms of a math department or a science department, but they're using their universal screening data, in that case in particular usually CDTs, as the data they're using, and their data analyzing around that within teams that are more grouped by specific content areas. So you have to ensure that all of your tier 1 is physically in place and that you're evaluating that. Just a few other key points about tier 1 is you have adequate time that is allocated for instruction, and typically, although you're not going to see this in writing here, but typically, especially in the primary grades, K, 1 and 2, maybe even 3 as well, you want at least 90 minutes every day of core instruction around reading and language arts. I would even argue maybe 2 hours. Not just 90 minutes, and math probably about the same. As you move up into the intermediate grades, we do typically see some of those minutes being shaved up, but you need lots of time. And kids need to be actively engaged during that time. So we need to be using evidence-based practices at the core level, at tier 1. And there's great resources available for what are evidence-based practices in tier 1. So what are good, effective teaching practices that can be delivered in just about any setting? There's lots of different resources for that, but John Hattie would be one. Marzano is another great author that gives us great understandings of what exactly are those effective tier 1 teaching practices that work for large proportions of kids. So you want to make sure that you're delivering those things on a regular basis within your core. In addition to that, we need to have some flexible grouping that occurs from time to time within that core, and by flexible grouping, we absolutely mean that. Kids are not necessarily anchored to a group for an extended period of time just because of their performance on a singular universal screener. And in fact, we would argue that those groupings should be changing fairly regularly, every couple of weeks perhaps. Just depends upon the nature of the instruction at that given point in time and the practices that are being implemented at tier 1. So that group ought to be very flexible, not kids being put into a group for 45 days or a marking period and they never move out of that particular group. And we're always using data to inform that practice. So when I was a practitioner, many years ago, before MTSS was even a thing, and we were just kind of figuring out this RTI stuff, as a school psychologist, I spent a great deal of time in kindergarten and first grade classrooms. I was push-in support. I don't have a teaching background. I don't have a master's degree in any sort of literacy or anything like that, but I wanted to provide preventative services. So a speech pathologist and I offered push-in support for the classroom teachers 3 times a week, and we were doing flexible grouping, and the data that we were using were really curriculum-based measures, CBMs, that we would gather on a weekly basis, and we would move kids out. So it was literally horse trading between the teacher, the SLP, and myself, figuring out, okay, this kid, we can move this kid into the middle group, move this kid down a group, because this next week we're working on this particular skill. That is exactly what we should be doing, and using some curriculum-based measures and other anecdotal data to inform how we are grouping kids and flexing that group fairly regularly and rapidly. That is what we should be doing in Tier 1. As I noted, we should also be establishing the degree with which Tier 1 is being implemented with integrity. This is important not only for service delivery, but as we will see a little bit later on, it is critical when using MTSS for eligibility decision making. Because if we're using MTSS for eligibility decision making, we have to assure that Tier 1 was implemented with integrity. Here is an example. The PET-R, the Planning and Evaluation Tool for Effective School-Wide Reading Systems, obviously, as the name would suggest, is specific to reading. This is a series of self-reflected assessments for all teachers in a school. Those data are then aggregated, and you get a proportion of staff who report degrees of implementation across the key metrics, key indicators of MTSS for service delivery. We don't have time to dive into this particular measure, but you can very easily Google this name of this tool and find it. I found it relatively easily as well. There's a fillable PDF that you can download and utilize. There are others just like it that are available, but we would strongly recommend that schools are utilizing on a regular basis some sort of fidelity measure that assesses Tier 1 practices and procedures. That's true if you're using MTSS just for service delivery, but absolutely necessary when using MTSS for eligibility decision making. So that's Tier 1. Questions, comments about Tier 1? I didn't really do it justice because we only spent about 15 minutes on Tier 1, but I told you it was going to be a quick review. All right, being none, then I will move on to Tier 2 and Tier 3, so the advanced tiers. Tier 2, supplemental supports, typically allocated for about 15 to 20% of your population. If you see more than 20 to 25% of your population requiring Tier 2 supports, that means something's wrong with Tier 1. Got to go back to Tier 1 and fix whatever is not working. These, of course, are the services that we align to specific student needs. As a consequence, you need very specific types of assessments that can identify skill deficit areas, and you group kids based upon common identified needs. So in the area of reading, for example, you might identify in a group of first grade kids that their phonemic awareness is rather limited. So that might be an opportunity for Tier 2 levels of support, small group instruction using a standard protocol intervention that focuses on boosting phonemic awareness skills. In the area of math, you might have a group of third graders who struggle with basic math facts. And so consequently, you might have small grouping at Tier 2 levels of support for kids who would get specific math intervention to deal with, say, for example, 2-digit plus 1-digit math addition, 2-digit plus 1-digit arithmetic using regrouping or whatever. So you are identifying very specific needs that are common amongst a number of students and then providing supplemental supports for those students specific to their skill deficit. Notably, Tier 2 does not replace Tier 1. This is an addition. That, I think, was a common misconception when MTSS first came out, and I know when I was a practitioner was a misconception as well, that Tier 2 was replacing time from Tier 1. Absolutely not. So this is additional instructional opportunity time for all students to receive Tier 2 supports. So for students who are typically developing, maybe this is an opportunity for them to do some enrichment or some other activities that maybe you're not able to get to. And for kids who are very advanced, maybe this is an opportunity to accelerate them even further. But this is not intended to replace core instruction for students who are struggling. This is an add-on. So we absolutely must assure that that is happening. Similar to at Tier 1, we know at least one indicator of the success of Tier 2 is that approximately 80% of kids in Tier 2 supports are improving. They're getting better. If you have a group of kids that are involved in some sort of a standard protocol Tier 2 support program, and less than 80% of them are improving, then something's wrong with the instruction. You need to revisit that. So going back to my experience, we were using Ladders to Literacy and Road to the Code, and oldies but goodies. We were using that, and if I noticed my group, which had the highest need kids, if they weren't improving, if the bulk of those kids were not improving, then there was something wrong. There was a mismatch, perhaps, with their skill deficit and what instruction they were being offered. It might have also been an issue related to the rigor of my instruction. It could have been that they needed more time, more intensity. So there's lots of things that we had to consider if the bulk of the kids were not improving in Tier 2 supports. But that is a general, relatively easy way of empirically establishing whether or not Tier 2 is effective. It ought to be effective for large proportions of your students. Just as a quick note, standard protocol intervention, because oftentimes that term is used correctly or incorrectly depending upon what necessarily you're reading, and in this particular context, we are categorizing a standard protocol intervention as typically something that is offered in Tier 2 or Tier 3. It is intervention or a set of procedures that have a strong evidence base, meaning there is research to support it, or in particular, some cases, there are actual studies that evaluate the efficacy of that actual practice. So there's a solid evidence base for it, and the evidence clearly indicates there's a high probability that this type of an approach, when matched correctly to specific skill deficits, is generally effective for large proportions of students. It's typically provided in small groups. It oftentimes, but not necessarily always, is scripted. And the scripted nature of it, which can be difficult for some folks to kind of get accustomed to, but the scripted nature of it is specifically to ensure that there is a higher degree of likelihood that the person implementing it is not deviating too differently from how it's intended to be delivered. And for folks such as me, who don't have a teaching background necessarily, but want to do push-in support, I love scripted stuff because then I just follow the standard protocol. I don't have to have a wealth of training and experience in, say, literacy acquisition in order to necessarily effectively deliver that particular intervention. So we have lots of examples of standard protocol interventions for both English language arts as well as math. And we would recommend that you utilize a number of outstanding internet or web-based resources that provide basically consumer reports about efficacy of certain interventions, because you may not necessarily be selecting a standard protocol intervention that has an evidence base. So in no particular order, and not certainly endorsing these as better than any others, but hopefully you're hearing some that might ring a bell. So in the area of reading in particular, and we focus primarily at the primary and intermediate grades, the use of Elkonin boxes. So sound boxes, evidence-based practice, that's good. Repeated readings, read naturally, paired reading, fast forward, read 180. These are all, and there are certainly many, many more, these are all standard protocol interventions that have a very strong evidence base. But there are also practices that aren't necessarily commercially available products that work really, really well. So repeated reading, for example, is not a packaged curriculum per se. It's just a process, a supplemental support that kids can be provided to help them. In the area of math, we have curricular or standard protocol interventions like hot math, number rocket, spring math. Those are just a few of the many, many. But we also have just good teaching practices and interventions that are highly effective, like incremental rehearsal or drill sandwiches. That's not a curriculum, that's just an instructional practice that has a very, very strong evidence base, actually about 30 years of evidence to suggest it is very, very effective. So these are all just a very, very short list of some of the standard protocol interventions, whether they're commercially available or not, that can be embedded into advanced tiers of support within MTSS. A question? Yes, thank you.
When you're talking about
does not have, I'm talking to this. Our district doesn't have tons of money to spend on programs.
Sure.
But when you start talking about these different practices that like our reading and math specialists could use because they would like them, is there, I mean, I've tried Google searching things like that, but is there a good go-to website to get these kinds of things beyond teachers pay teachers that isn't research-based?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to focus more on literacy. Just because that one, actually, there's a whole host of websites, and admittedly, that is also an area that with which I'm far more familiar than math. And so the Florida Center for Reading Research is a great place to go to. You can go to the RTI National Technical Assistance Center, and that would have a list of both reading and math. University of Oregon has good resources. I'm assuming, but I can't specifically point to one, I'm sure Patton has a lot of helpful resources that are available. Yeah, so you don't want to just be picking the thing that somebody saw at a conference because the salesperson had really good tchotchkes. And that's unfortunately what happens far too often is somebody in your district went to a conference somewhere and the salesperson was really good and sold them on a particular product that may or may not have a good evidence base. It's a good starting point, but then you need to independently validate its efficacy. Excellent question. Any others? So yeah, those would be a very short list of the Patton website, Florida Center for Reading Research, the RTI National Technical Assistance Center. I can't remember the URL for it, but you can Google that and you'll find it. University of Oregon. There's a few other places as well that do a great job of reviewing those elements. Florida Center for Reading Research is the one with which I'm most familiar. They have a consumer reports guide that literally has, if you're familiar with consumer reports, they've got little circles, and if it's filled in, that means it has lots of evidence that it's going to be effective. If it's not filled in, that means there's virtually no evidence that it's effective, and there's a nice little key. So it's a quick, easy way to evaluate whether or not what you're considering has an evidence base. Good question. And I'm glad that you asked that question because it is critical that schools, with their limited resources and also, frankly, with the limited time that you have with kids, are using things that are effective as opposed to things that are ineffective.
Like our math and reading specialists, like they want to do these things.
Sure.
It's just they don't have the resources to do them. So that's like a big bridge I'm trying to cross right now to support them, to give them what they need to do.
Sure, and some of these are inexpensive or free. So I mentioned incremental rehearsal or drill sandwiches. That's not a curriculum. That's just a process for teaching. So that doesn't cost any money. Paired readings or repeated readings, that's not a curriculum. You can just teach people how to do that. And in my case, Road to the Code and Ladders to Literacy was a relatively inexpensive spiral-bound. I still have it, and I visualize it's all torn up, but that was pretty inexpensive, and with lots of reproducibles, and someone like me who doesn't necessarily have a teaching background could theoretically implement it with little to no training. Absolutely. Okay. So just as we did with Tier 1, we got to make sure that Tier 1 is being implemented with integrity. You got to make sure the same thing is true at Tier 2. Because again, this is all building up to, if you're going to use MTSS for eligibility decision making, you got to validate that Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 were implemented with integrity. So your fidelity checks at Tier 2 are a little less well known, and we don't necessarily have a whole bunch of different empirically established protocols or assessments at advanced tiers. But what you should see is that the processes associated with Tier 2 are in place. So do you have progress monitoring data that were collected regularly? You can just look at your progress monitoring data to establish whether or not you have lots of progress monitoring data. Were there data analysis teams that met on a regular basis and reviewed those data? That is all memorial, or ought to be memorialized in team meeting notes. Those would be some of the indicators that Tier 2 was implemented with integrity. Further, you ought to see that the majority of kids who are placed appropriately matched to Tier 2 supports are benefiting from that level of support. If you don't see a majority or a large majority of students benefiting in your Tier 2 supports, that tells you that Tier 2 is not functioning appropriately, and you need to reconsider what you're doing at Tier 2. So the illustration here is that if you have 10 students in a small group at Tier 2 and you're implementing some sort of standard protocol intervention in, say, math, for example, you ought to see approximately 80% or 8 out of 10 kids improving. If not, then it tells you that there probably isn't something wrong with the kids, there is something wrong with Tier 2. So you need to reevaluate the quality of Tier 2. All right. There is a fair amount of content that we have here in the next number of slides that addresses very specifically English learners, ELs. And I am going to be the first to say that this is not an EL training. And secondly, this is just a very superficial review of EL needs within MTSS service delivery and MTSS for eligibility decision making. But we felt it was important to at least acknowledge that ELs have particular needs that obviously make them unique, and we cannot forget that their needs need to be adequately addressed within the MTSS service delivery model in order to furthermore utilize MTSS for eligibility decision making. The first and most important piece is that we have to rule out or in whether the English learner's proficiency was one of the contributing factors to their lack of progress. And so we do that typically in every school because it's federally mandated. We do that by screening for their home language utilization. And if there is a positive screen, meaning that there is an indication that in the home there are other languages that are spoken, if not the primary language is not English, then we need to evaluate much more specifically their English language proficiency. And we have to be aware of the fact that there are two very distinct and critically important pieces to English language proficiency. That is BICS, which is basic interpersonal communicative skills, and that is the social, very briefly, and probably not doing it extreme justice, but the social communicative skills in the English language. That's BICS. And typically, ELs develop BICS a lot more quickly, and that is typically what most adults in buildings observe anecdotally, is kids develop that social, interactive, and communicative skills relatively quickly. But the challenge is, however, that BICS is not necessarily the only thing, the only skill that is required in order to progress appropriately in a typical learning environment in our school setting. What is more important actually is CALP, and that's Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. That is the English proficiency that is necessary to understand and benefit from teacher instruction. That's very different, because socially communicating with peers or adults in a building in English is a lot easier for most ELs than it is understanding the academic language that is used during instruction. So we have to be very much aware of this distinction between BICS and CALP. And we also need to assess not only BICS, but also the CALP of our students who are English learners. Because with insufficient CALP, it is very likely that ELs will struggle with benefiting from typical classroom instruction absent any real robust ESL support. And consequently, a student who has very low CALP, in other words, they don't have the cognitive or academic language proficiency to maximally benefit from the typical instruction, is very unlikely to be considered eligible for special education because of a primary concern that there is a limited English proficiency that is a barrier to success in a typical schooling program. It's not to say that they can't have a disability, but it just means it's going to muddy the situation. Because if their CALP is very weak, understandably so, they may not benefit very well from typical instruction without very robust, adequate, and very comprehensive ESL supports. So that is absolutely critical that we're understanding and assessing those particular skills. Just skipping ahead in the interest of time, there are lots of data that we believe are very important for ELs to not only collect but also analyze to gauge not only their BICS but also their CALP. We can look at anecdotal evidence, anecdotal data from the adults and from observations of particular students in school settings to just observe how they're interacting not only socially, that would be BICS, but also how well they're interacting within really rigorous, explicit, direct instruction of the academic skills. That would be more of a focus of their CALP. We can access and utilize biannual assessment data provided by the WIDA, and in this particular case, it's the measure of developing English language, or the model. So that data is very helpful. For those who aren't familiar, it's K to 12 and can be administered up to 2 times a year, kind of like progress monitoring of EL's English proficiency progress over the course of the year. Other formative and summative data, which would largely include those curriculum-based or classroom-based measures, would be good indicators of overall English proficiency and development as well. Notably, EL's universal screening data, as well as their progress monitoring data, probably should not be compared to non-EL students because it's a different demographic, it's a different normative group, so we have to be really careful when we're interpreting triannual and/or progress monitoring data of EL students, because the typical normative sample for universal screening as well as progress monitoring is not specific to ELs. So we have to be very, very careful about when we're using our universal and/or progress monitoring data to establish proficiency or growth using normative data that are not necessarily representative of EL students. In addition, specific to ELs, on the left-hand side, hopefully you recognize that those are all key indicators of efficient problem-solving teams within MTSS. But there is an additional set of needs for MTSS problem-solving teams as it relates to English learners. We have to make sure that there is expertise on the problem-solving team with particular expertise in English language development and proficiency, and that we are analyzing appropriate language assessments in the context of other data at Tier 1 and Tier 2. So it is inappropriate to have data analysis teams data analyzing information about ELs without expertise in ESL and on EL development as a key member of that team. So we just have to make sure that those partners are on those teams and part of that process. Okay. Again, I know I'm not doing it justice, but in the interest of time and focusing on the main point of our gathering today, I just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of that need for additional expertise on our data analysis teams. The problem-solving process for ELs is essentially the same as it would be for English-speaking students, but notably we're sensitive to the types of data, effective teaching practices, protocols, and supports that would be necessary to adequately support our EL population. And then the next 3 slides give us a really good comprehensive review of what are some additional data pieces within an MTSS service delivery model that would be important for validating not only the implementation of the 3 tiers of support for EL students, but also assuring that our processes are also in place to maximally benefit our EL population. Some of you, especially the school psyches that are participating, might be familiar with a matrix called the Riot ISIL matrix. Riot, R-I-O-T, and ISIL, I-C-E-L. Either people are really tired, they're tired of hearing me say this or talk, or they want to go home because I see some glossed over looks, or they maybe are unfamiliar with Riot. So Riot ISIL is simply this. So Riot stands for, what does it stand for? It stands for record review, interview, observation, and test. So those are 4 broad methodologies used to collect data. Riot, so record review, interview, observe, and test. ISIL stands for the things that you want to do a record review on, you want to observe, you want to interview, and you want to test. And ISIL stands for instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner. So the Riot ISIL matrix is, by my estimation, a great framework to help us conceptualize not only how we should collect data at all 3 tiers, but also what we should be focusing our data collection on. We should be collecting data through record reviews, interviews, observations, and tests, that's Riot, on things like, what's the curriculum? What kind of instruction is being delivered? What's the learning environment look like? And how does the learner interact or engage with the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment? If you think of the Riot ISIL matrix as a framework to gather information about different things and using different modalities, you are taking an ecological approach to understanding students' responsiveness to instruction. And that approach really focuses our energy on the alterable things that we can change to help kids get better or to do better. If you disregard ecology, if you disregard instruction, curriculum, environment, and the learner, then you are running the risk of thinking that when a kid is not successful, the reason is there's something wrong with the kid. And you are largely ignoring everything else that engages or interfaces with the kid. And MTSS is an ecological approach rooted in the belief that if kids are struggling, it is because the environment isn't suiting the kids' needs, and we need to assess what is going on in the environment that needs to change. That's MTSS. That is using the Riot ISIL matrix as a framework for what kinds of data and how we collect that information, all to benefit kids. So perhaps maybe that was a new learning experience for some of you, because I see people writing frenetically Riot, or I'm assuming hopefully you're writing Riot ISIL matrix. In the context of Riot ISIL for ELs, well, we use that same kind of framework, that ecological approach to gather data about English learners. But please understand, you should be using Riot ISIL for everybody. But let's put it in the framework, or in the context, excuse me, of English learners. So we should be evaluating the learning environment, interviewing and observing ESL teachers working with English learners, evaluating the appropriateness of the English language development program that is delivered by our ESL teachers. In other words, what is the overall quality of the curriculum? Is it appropriate to meet the students' needs at Tier 1, at Tier 2? And you're going to get that information by interviewing, by reviewing the curriculum itself, perhaps maybe leaning on the expertise of the ESL teacher, but also doing some observations in the classroom. Maybe not you as a classroom teacher, but your school psychs, your support staff ought to be collecting those kinds of data, all in an effort to evaluate the quality of the learning environment for ELs. You can look at academic and instructional factors. So that's looking at the environment and the quality of the instruction. So that's the E and the I of ISIL. The first one was the C, the curriculum. The next two are the I and the E, the instruction and the environment. You could also look at some of the data related to development of oral and literacy factors. So some of this might actually be assessing or testing the kid. So here's where we're getting to the T of Riot, where we're testing, and the L of ISIL, we're testing the kid, perhaps. So you're gathering lots of data, all in an effort to evaluate the quality of the ecology around the kid, recognizing that if a kid is struggling, it's not a problem internal to the kid. It's a problem with the ecologies being a mismatch for students' needs. In other words, it's a problem with the environment. And the problem isn't because the educators have been uncaring. It's just that there is a mismatch between the students' needs and the type of ecologies and the quality of the ecologies that are being implemented to support a student. All right, so again, in the interest of time, and certainly not doing it justice, but because we want to move on, the remaining slides we'll just leave for your review at a later point in time. But please, again, the underscore here is that we want to be collecting lots of data about the quality of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 for ELs, because they have obviously very specific needs. Fundamentally, within the context of MTSS and EL students, we need to use a variety of data to help us evaluate the integrity of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 before we even consider special education eligibility for our EL students. In addition, we have to make sure that their cognitive, academic, language proficiency, their CALP, or their ability to understand, comprehend, and interact in a English-dominant learning environment is sufficient for them to adequately benefit from the typical types of instruction that is provided, even with robust ESL services. Because if MTSS is not meeting their needs from an ecological perspective, and if their language proficiency is not real strong, then we cannot consider a student who is EL for eligibility for special education because their English proficiency is likely a very significant contributing factor for their lack of progress. So I know I didn't do it adequate justice, but and certainly we have trainings, the patent system and I use have trainings specific to EL, but I wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page with regard to EL needs. And for those who might be interested, here is just a very short list. I know that the patent website has been revitalized, revamped in the last few months, and seemingly with each passing day, more resources are being put on its website. But we would encourage those who have particular needs relative to EL would visit the patent website for much more robust, comprehensive resources than maybe what I provided in the past 25 minutes or so. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts? All right, so we've been chugging away for approximately 61 minutes, so hopefully we'll be able to continue going here for a little bit. I will plan for a break here probably the next half hour or so. That's about the middle of our morning. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and start to review, hopefully very specifically, the meat of the content for today, as well as, I hope, the main reason why maybe you're here today. And that is, how do we use MTSS, specifically ROI, rate of improvement, and level, to determine eligibility for specific learning disabilities? So just as a reminder that in order to be classified as having a specific learning disability in any of the areas, 4 criteria have to be met. And these 4 criteria have been visually represented here by colleagues at the patent system, as well as one of my near and dear friends, Joe Kowaleski, visually representing those 4 criteria. The 2 criteria on the left, yes, on the left, are inclusionary, meaning essentially you have to say yes to those. The 2 on the right are exclusionary. In other words, you have to say no to any of those things. And if you say yes to the first 2 on the left and no to the 2 on the right, then you have minimally met the criteria necessary for consideration of a disability. But also remember that eligibility determination for a disability is 2-pronged. You got to first have a disability and demonstrate a need. And that need factor is not necessarily specifically indicated in this visual representation. This visual representation focuses on the first of the 2-pronged criteria for eligibility. That is, does the child have a disability? So we are going to spend the rest of the day, the rest of this morning, excuse me, talking about the first 2 criteria. That would be failure to meet age or grade level state standards, that's level. That's the first one, and then the second one is basically rate of improvement or progress. We're going to spend the bulk of the rest of our morning on criteria 1 and 2. We're going to almost skip, although we'll just briefly remind you about criteria 3 and 4 at the very end of today's presentation. That does not mean that criteria 3 and 4 are less important. Those are equally as important in order to establish whether an individual has a disability. But our focus today is on operationalizing the first 2 criteria. And so I just ethically, legally, feel the need to remind you that there are 4 criteria to determine whether a student has a disability for SLD, and we're largely going to focus our attention on criteria 1 and 2. So the first one is level. And what do we mean by level? Well, very specifically, criterion 1 states that the question is, does the child adequately achieve age or grade-based standards as defined by the state? And so the question then is, how well is a student performing at this point in time? So this is a static indicator of student performance. How are they doing right now? Now, a group or an MDT can determine that a child has an SLD in any one of those 8 categories that are listed right there. And by the way, those 8 categories for the large part have remained relatively the same for the past 20 some odd years, although there was one that was added in the late 90s that was reading fluency skills, but all the other ones have been around for a long, long period of time. So nothing has really changed in terms of the areas of deficiency that we're looking for to identify a student as having an SLD. Notably, the research is very strong for using MTSS logic for eligibility decision making in the areas of reading. Very, very strong. It's also in the last couple of years getting much stronger in the area of math. It is not nearly as strong in the areas of writing, oral expression, and listening comprehension. So admittedly, the logic and the evidence behind using MTSS for eligibility decision-making for an SLD in those areas, writing, written expression, oral language, or expression, and listening comprehension is not nearly as strong. But it is absolutely robust in the areas of reading, and in the last 5 to 7 years, it has become much more robust in math as well. Consequently, we feel very comfortable suggesting that you can use MTSS service delivery and eligibility decision-making processes for math and reading very, very confidently if you have all of these pieces in place. Those are okay. All right, when I hear that ding, I get a little worried. Either someone's won a jackpot somewhere or there's a question. Jackpot. Harrisburg's on. All right, welcome Harrisburg. All right. So that very first question is related to students' level of proficiency at this point in time. So fundamentally, the determining factor for you as a school district and a school building is to determine how low is too low. That's the fundamental question. The question more deeply is in reference to the discrepancy or the disparity between a student of concern and his or her peers. So there are a bunch of different ways, actually, in which you can operationalize or quantify this notion of how low. So you could look at the difference between a student's performance right now from expected benchmark. And benchmark is a term that I'm going to define here in just a few moments, a little bit more deeply, but it's essentially where do we want kids to be at this point in time. You could also look at the discrepancy between a student's performance right now and some grade level standard, which is a slightly different way of conceptualizing level and how low or how high someone is. And a third slightly different way of conceptualizing how low a student is in reference to their relative performance compared to a nationally representative sample of other kids that are either the same age or in some circumstances you could look at grade-based comparisons. So while on the surface these all may seem extremely similar if not identical, they are slight variations on the same theme. And interestingly enough, there is not necessarily consensus in the empirical literature about how to define how low is too low. Consequently, Patton and the IUs do not necessarily dictate a singular way for identifying how low is too low, which for some of you may seem rather frustrating, because maybe you came here wanting to know what is the magic formula. There is no magic formula that Patton, the IUs, or frankly even the empirical literature is suggesting is the only way to do this. What this then means is that individual LEAs and school buildings need to figure this out themselves, and arguably should memorialize the criteria used to evaluate how low is too low. Establish in advance what is the threshold for either too low and might be indicative of a disability or not, and use that in your decision-making process for all kids. So if you thought you were going to walk away today with exactly what Patton, IU, or myself or my colleagues in the research world are indicating is too low, I'm sorry to disappoint you. However, we will give you some guidance as to what some of the trends in the literature and in practice are suggesting. And then we hope that would then inform your decision made at a local level. Okay, so before we even get to what is considered too low, I want to just remind you that schools are flush with data, especially if you're using MTSS for service delivery. You ought to have a ton of data to help you establish how low is too low. And in fact, if you are using the three-tiered logic for service delivery correctly, that is, it's established with a high degree of integrity, then I would argue you need no more data than what you already have to establish not only level of proficiency, but also for the second criterion, rate of improvement, or ROI. You don't need any additional assessment data, frankly, if you're doing MTSS for service delivery and you're doing it well. So some of our standard existing or extant data would be your statewide assessment data. Not forgetting PVOS data are incredibly helpful, especially obviously once you hit 4th grade and above. So PVOS data would be widely helpful in establishing level, as well as your universal screeners, those benchmarking assessments that are done 3 times a year. And if you are implementing MTSS service delivery correctly at the advanced tiers, you ought to have drill down assessment data for particular kids that clearly indicates that they have deficiencies in certain skill areas that are way below grade or age expectations. And then lastly, what is their final performance on the last progress monitoring probe? That is one of the more obvious illustrations of the usefulness of those data in establishing the level of proficiency. You could consider, a school could consider additional data via norm referenced assessments that school psychs are very familiar with. And in fact, in the illustrative ER that we have for you in your materials, that school district opted to collect additional norm reference data. But frankly, from my perspective, those norm reference data were unnecessary in establishing whether or not the student had a disability. I don't know the rationale or justification for why the district collected norm reference data, but if anything, it just confirmed what was already very evident in their MTSS data that they already had. And then we could consider curriculum-based evaluation data, and for reference, Howell, HOSP, and HOSP is a great resource that helps us understand this process, which drills down very specifically to specific skills and whether students have mastered very discrete skills within the broader context of reading, math, and writing. But fundamentally, if you're doing MTSS service delivery correctly, you really can rely on your extant data to help you make that eligibility decision making with regard to level as well as rate of improvement. So that notion of, for criterion 1, we have a lack of achievement is in relation to age or grade level standards. Well, we should be evaluating and noting very clearly that the student is performing well below peers. And there should be absolute documentation via multiple confirming data. Please notice in the first bullet there is the word all before measures. all data should be very clearly pointing in the same direction, that this particular student is performing well below peers, well below grade expectations. What we mean by that is, more specifically, if you have 1 or 2 data points that suggest the kid is well below peers, but lots of other data saying the kid's doing just fine, then you probably shouldn't be considering this kid for a disability. You should have a preponderance of data that very clearly is pointing or concluding all the same thing, that there is a particular student who is well below peers. Notably, using MTSS for eligibility decision making, you will never hear me or anyone else suggest that you're looking at IQ or cognitive abilities. MTSS for service delivery, as well as eligibility determination, does not rely on standardized, norm-referenced intellectual or cognitive ability assessments. Gone is the need for those measures for this particular disability category. It is absolutely necessary for someone who is thought to be disabled under the category of intellectually disabled. But for SLD, IQ is irrelevant. And frankly, what this does is it allows us to identify those kids as having an SLD who many years ago, for those more senior people in the room like myself, who struggled with the kid who never had that magical discrepancy between IQ and achievement. They never had that 15-point split or 20-point split because their IQ was in the 80s, and it was really, really hard to get an achievement score that was way below 80. We don't have that problem anymore because proficiency level is not pegged to cognitive abilities. It is absolutely not. It is all pegged to what is expected of all kids in a particular grade. So consequently, we are making a normative comparison regarding student level and whether or not their current performance is too low. Thankfully, most of the universal screening measures that school districts are using already have a very robust normative data set to give us all the data we need in order to fully appraise level of a particular student. But notably, there might be reason for individual school districts to consider local norms if the student population is markedly different from national data. But I would caution that school districts only use local norms when they've thoroughly vetted the fact that norm data from national samples does not adequately represent their local context. And this does happen from time to time. Just had some conversations with school psychs in another part of the state who really have fully appraised the fact that their local norming data are markedly different than national trends. So they are resorting more to looking at normative data at a local level than at a national level. But they have very carefully, thoughtfully, and comprehensively evaluated that decision. But for the most part, most schools would largely be able to utilize national normative data when making decisions about level as well as rate of improvement. So fundamentally, the question is, how low is too low? And because there is no consensus in the literature, and because our state, rightfully so, does not dictate this, it is ultimately the responsibility of the district to establish what is too low. And I would strongly recommend that districts establish this threshold in advance of utilizing MTSS for eligibility decision making. So here are some suggestions, because at least we can leave you with some suggestions. So the contemporary literature very clearly says that if kids are at a level that equates to the 35th percentile rank or above, they're going to be okay. And that has been evident time and time again with large and small sample studies, that kids who perform at the 35th percentile rank and above are generally going to be fine as long as you don't stop teaching them. So essentially they ought to be okay. So very clearly we know that if kids are, their level of performance is at the 35th percentile rank or above, they should not be considered eligible as having an SLD. That shouldn't even cross your mind. But what that does mean is that deficient level should be markedly below the 35th percentile rank. Many, but not all, researchers and schools implementing MTSS for eligibility determination purposes peg deficient level at or around the 10th percentile rank. So that is a strong, both empirically based as well as practitioner friendly approach to establishing what is deficient level. That said, some may argue rather successfully that maybe the 15th percentile rank and below is considered deficient level. So somewhere between the 10th and maybe a little bit higher could be an indicator of deficient level, which would then trigger that criterion 1 has been met. Another way, or another suggestion, which is different than the standard 10th percentile rank and below or 15th percentile rank and below, would be the 2 times calculation that was proffered by Shin and colleagues a number of years ago. And those of you who maybe have been to previous trainings related to ROI and MTSS for eligibility might be familiar with this 2 times calculation. So this is a different approach than using a pre-established cut score based on percentile rank performance. A 2-time calculation means you take the norm group average and divide it by the student's performance. And by the way, this is not using their percentile rank performance, this is actually using their raw score on a universal screener, or in this case, would likely be a progress monitoring probe. And consequently, what you get is a ratio of deficiency. And Shin and others would argue that an individual who is 2 times below the typical is someone who might meet the first criterion of the 4 criterion for SLD determination. So let me show you what that could look like. First, these are normative data that are not from a particular product. So these are not AimsWeb or Dibbles or Star or any of the commercially available products normative data. These are just general data that are produced by Hasbrook and Tyndall, who have been providing these kinds of data for well over a decade. We would caution that if you choose to go through, if you choose to use a 2 times discrepant approach, that you use your product's normative data. Please make sure you're using your product's normative data. But for illustrative purposes, and to be true to the fact that we don't want to necessarily endorse one product over another, these are generic data. So if we consider a 4th grade student, and the district itself has said that typical is pegged to the 50th percentile rank, then what is highlighted here is the typical standard for winter in or reading fluency for a 4th grade kid, as determined by the school district, is 120 words correct per minute. So if that is what the district has established, that is typical, and you could debate whether 50th percentile rank is appropriate or not, but this district has selected 50th percentile rank as its benchmark. Then let's say we have John, who is a 4th grader, who is reading at the middle of the school year 60 words correct per minute. Then the math is relatively straightforward using this 2 times discrepant logic. The district pre-established that 120 words correct per minute is the appropriate benchmark at 4th grade in winter. You divide that number by John's performance of 60, and we get a 2 times discrepant ratio. So that means John's reading fluency is 2 times discrepant, it's half, of the typical student. And because this district established a priori, they were going to use a 2 times discrepant approach to determining what is deficient level. John would meet the first criterion of having deficient level. Does that make sense? So I've just shared with you 2 possible ways of identifying what is, or operationalizing, what is deficient level. You could go a straight, draw a line in the sand based upon percentile rank, or you could use a 2 times discrepant approach. Both approaches are supported in the empirical literature and are used in practice in many states and school districts. As I noted before, there is no consensus, and PDE, Patent, and the IUs are not necessarily dictating either one of these or another one. These are just 2 research-supported and practically useful approaches for establishing deficient level. Questions, comments? Let me let you soak that in and see if there are any questions or comments. Okay. All right, being none, in addition or a complement to either using a percentile level threshold or a discrepancy from typical approach, you could evaluate the deficiency of your student in question based upon some of your CBE, your curriculum-based evaluative data, which might include drill-down assessments. So here we have an illustration of drill-down assessments for John using the core multiple measures, which I'm not necessarily pushing this particular product, but it is a great resource that we use in our training program at IUP. I also, when I consult with schools, I strongly recommend that they use the core multiple measures. It's a relatively inexpensive book, and it's basically a series of assessments that drill down very discretely into specific literacy skills, very specific, in great detail. And in fact, it is abundantly helpful for instructional planning, but it can also be useful for establishing deficient level for eligibility decision making. So, one of those particular measures is a core phonics survey. And as you can see in those bulleted items under the core phonics survey, each one of those bullets is actually a different assessment that assesses a very specific skill. And the assessment tool also provides recommendations for what is considered target, strategic, or intensive performance based upon raw scores in each of those domains. And please understand that those levels are guides. They're not intended to be rigid, necessarily empirically established levels, but they give us some indication as to overall skill deficits in particular areas. So just very quickly, we can identify via those drill down assessments for John that there are some very specific skills that clearly are deficient for him at the 4th grade level. Remember, John's in 4th grade. So not only does this tell us that there are specific skill areas for which John is very deficient compared to grade level expectations, but also, importantly, not only for advanced tiers of instruction, but if John is eventually going to be identified for special education services, these kinds of data ought to be very, very helpful for special ed IEP teams in order to write goals, especially for the first initial IEP, which in my experience, there are lots of people sitting around the table who have never met John, or they know John just only in passing, and so it's helpful if these kinds of data are available to help guide the authoring of that initial IEP. So these data, these CBE data, in addition to either the threshold based upon percentile rank or a discrepancy analysis, but not discrepancy, traditional discrepancy, but discrepancy between typical performance and actual performance, might be additional benefit for data that all should converge on the same conclusion, that this student is performing at a deficient level. So, in conclusion, before we actually have a little bit of an activity and a built-in break, perfect timing, not planned this way, but it worked out, is that please note, I never once mentioned that we're talking about a student's performance pegged to IQ. That is an irrelevant issue because we're using MTSS systems to identify SLD. So no reference to performance compared to IQ. And consequently, those students who, under a very traditional approach for SLD identification using IQ achievement discrepancy, The students who, within that older framework, who would typically not be identified because they didn't have a high enough IQ, they would absolutely be eligible under criterion 1 because we're not pegging their performance to IQ. Furthermore, and this goes to the last bullet, we address the common misconception that students with very high IQs who have achievement scores that are in the average range are not necessarily disabled in the area of reading, math, or whatever, because they have this discrepancy. They have an IQ of, say, 143, and they've got achievement scores that are in the 115, and that is discrepant using the traditional IQ achievement discrepancy. But you always kind of scratch your head wondering, well, wait a minute, if their reading scores are above average, how are they disabled in reading? Not really sure that's the case. So using MTSS for eligibility decision making largely addresses the previous concern or clarification regarding students who have very high IQs and are reading rather typically, and in some situations might be thought to have a disability, when in fact they may or very likely do not have a disability in reading, for example. So here is a little bit of homework as part of your break. So we're going to take, Silky, is it okay if we take a little bit of an extended break for work? Okay, so normally a break would be 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll in not only a break, but also a task for you to do. So this is going to be about a, let's see, about a 20-minute break. So you decide whether you need to take your physical break first and then come back and do the activity, or you do it second. But we will come back in about 20 minutes. So here's your task. What I'd like you to do is take out your evaluation report from your packet that was provided this morning, and don't do what it says on the screen here. It says read pages 1 through 14. No, I'm going to break it down a little bit. I'm going to chunk it. Instead, excuse me, what I'd like you to do is read pages 1 through 5. And very specifically, as you're reading pages 1 through 5, I want you to just get an idea of the student's background history and some of the observational data that were collected. So again, I'm going to have you read pages 1 through 5 and just look at getting an understanding of the student's background history, observations, and then when we come back in 20 minutes, we're going to talk about what kind of evidence has been provided that MTSS for service delivery has been provided. So your task is to read pages 1 through 5, get an understanding of the case, and then look for evidence that MTSS for service delivery was in fact provided. So you have 10 minutes to do that, as well as an additional 10 minutes to take a break. So we will start up, actually I'm feeling generous because you all traveled through this inclement weather. Let's do 23 minutes. So let's start back up at 25 after 10. We'll start promptly at that point in time. Thank you. All right, let's get started again. So thank you all for taking a break, and I hope you were able to maximize your time to not only just take a stretch break, but also to fulfill the task that I had for you. So we're not going to go over any of the background about this particular student, Jane, and Jane's history, but what I do want to do is go through very quickly, in the interest of time, and because all of you did the homework, I know you did, help me identify some of the evidence in the evaluation report on pages 1 through 5, have your emphasis on 5, by the way, related to whether or not the tiered instruction and fidelity of instruction was provided. So what specifically can you point to in the ER in those first 5 pages that clearly indicates a recognition that Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 were implemented with a degree of integrity? And everybody's head went way down. Okay, so let me give you some scaffolded assist. Ooh, we have a hand raised in the back. All right, thank you.
Okay, well, I will say they are using a screener. It says Dibbles next, so that's good that they're looking at data and they are meeting as a team.
Correct.
And then it also talked about foundations level 1 for the whole group, tier 1, so maybe they saw that they needed to add a layer into their core.
Okay. Thank you. So you get the prize for being the first one. Thank you. And you don't have to respond to any more questions for the rest of the morning. But yes, so we see evidence that they're using a research-validated universal screener, Dibbles Next, and that there's some data analysis teaming going on. And you made specific reference to some tier 1 instruction that's being delivered, and it was very specifically indicated. And I found at least one of the sections in the report here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. But this is, I believe this is page 5, and kind of in the top half of page 5. So there's very clear indication that Foundations Level 1 was implemented. Okay, great, thank you. Other comments related to evidence that tiered supports were being provided?
I saw one of the observations where it was independent work, computer work, and teacher work, and to see like how she would respond in the different educational environments. Where independent work, she had trouble staying on task and was responding better to the instruction in a small group. That would have been more differentiated instruction.
Absolutely. So I believe that was an observation 2. Is that correct? Yeah. So for those who are watching the screen, I apologize if I made you get sick there for a moment as I was scrolling through the pages. But yeah, so there's evidence in the classroom observation, at least the second one, indicating amount of time on task and responsiveness to the environment. There's that ecological kind of framework for this particular student across at least 3 different types of learning activities. Absolutely. Again, a recognition that ecology matters, and we're collecting data on that. So that's the observation, that's the O of Riot, about the interaction between the student and the instructional environment. That's the E of ISIL. Great, thank you.
I have a question about the timing between progress taken.
Sure, good
like
question.
From September to October, great, 5 weeks. And then we go to December, and then we go to February.
So I think I know what your concern is going to be, but why don't you indicate it clearly so that I don't misrepresent?
I mean, in my opinion, 4 weeks, take progress. If there's not significant progress, we make the next step towards determining.
Sure.
And that doesn't seem to be the case here.
Absolutely. That's a very, very good question, and not an uncommon question that folks have. So it is buried in the PowerPoint a little bit later, but because you brought it up, I think it's very pertinent and relevant to address that specific question right now, and that would be insensitive to you if I didn't address the question. So that being said, when we're talking about making decisions about movement amongst and within the tiers, there's not any specific guidance that is universally accepted, but we generally would say you want to wait between 4 and 8 weeks to make a decision about movement among the tiers. This is not specific to eligibility decision making for SLD. We're talking about movement. 4 to 8 weeks is a general rule of thumb with regard to how often or how long you should wait until you reevaluate the appropriateness of the tiered support. Please understand that that is a rule of thumb, but that rule of thumb is partially based on the intensity of the program, the number of school days or opportunities for delivering the supports. And in this particular case, I know this district fairly well, and there's a great deal of time that is off right around Thanksgiving for deer season. So there is the instruction is disrupted because there's additional days off that many other schools maybe wouldn't necessarily have. You also have the winter break, which is problematic as well because you lose instructional days there as well. But another factor that goes into how many weeks you should wait is the degree of frequency of progress monitoring that's actually done. So in other words, how many times do you assess the kid? If you're assessing the kid only every other week, then the duration of time you need to wait before determining whether there should be movement in the tiers should be longer. which specifically addresses the need, I think, at least explicitly addresses the need to progress monitor at a minimum every week. And especially at tier 3, when you're getting to that point of, ooh, this student may be considered as having a disability, you might consider progress monitoring twice a week, which is a heavy lift in terms of resources and time, and frankly, just actually doing it, but it gives you more data. All of this is related to the reality that when we're talking about moving kids amongst the tiers or within tiers, we need to have sufficient data and high quality data. And if you only have 4 data points and the assessments were done in not so ideal situations, the quality of those data is suspect, and therefore your decision, which is still a low or a moderate risk decision, might be compromised by data that have a lower level of integrity than you would want. So 4 to 8 weeks is generally a good rule of thumb, but you're absolutely right, this district waited a little bit longer than maybe many would want to do. I think it also, your comment speaks directly to some decisions that must be established at the local level as to how long is long enough, and embedded within that is how many times are you progress monitoring. If you can do it twice a week, especially at tier 3, the much better. If you're only doing it every other week, ooh, waiting 4 weeks, that means you're going to have at best 2 or 3 data points. Don't make a decision, even movement amongst the tiers with only 2 or 3 data points. Did I address your comment, your question? Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments? And I would say that your question would have come up somewhere else along the way by another audience member, so thank you for being the first to do it. And if this comes up again, I'm happy to address it through a different lens. Okay, so any other data specific to evidence that tiered supports were provided? The only other one that I would suggest is really important and ought to be documented in an ER would be some data-based decision used to establish that tiers 1, 2, and 3 and those interventions were actually implemented. And you will notice, again, don't stare up at the screen right at this moment, but on page 5, let's see, the 3rd paragraph down, 1, 2, 3, no, and I'm going to highlight it on the screen. For tier 1, foundations level 1, there is specific reference to fidelity checks. So this particular curriculum has fidelity checks that are part of the curriculum. And fidelity checks were completed, and there are data embedded in the ER that are useful for documenting that Tier 1 was actually delivered as designed. This is essential if we are truly going to use an ecological MTSS approach for determining SLD identification. You have to be able to substantiate that Tier 1 was implemented. Further, if you can recall, and I know you didn't have a lot of time to review this in great detail, there were some supplemental supports that were offered in Tier 1. So they went from whole group to some smaller group instruction, which would still be, in this case, considered Tier 1. That was offered in middle of October. And notice, fidelity of implementation was established by ambitious growth observed among all other students placed in that small group. That is yet another indicator of fidelity of an evidence-based program. If the evidence-based suggests the program is going to work, then it should work for the majority of individuals if implemented with integrity. Here are data to substantiate the fact that that small group, Foundations Level 1, actually was implemented because other kids in that small group started to improve. Jane, however, did not. We have data substantiating that Tier 2 and Tier 3 were implemented with integrity. And by the way, just as a reminder, Tier 2 and Tier 3 in this particular illustration were the 95 group phonics and phonological awareness interventions respectively. So that's Tier 2 and Tier 3. Notice that there are data specifically documented in the ER that observations were conducted on 3 randomly selected days, and the results of those observations both substantiated that Tier 2 and Tier 3 were in fact implemented. Absent fidelity data documented in an ER for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, you are running the risk of using MTSS processes for eligibility decision-making in a very inappropriate manner. You must be able to substantiate that Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 were, not only list what they were, but also that they were implemented with a degree of integrity. So I hope in this very condensed framework of a little over 3 hours, this gives you a little bit of insight as to how one school district has operationalized the extent to which they document the tiered levels of support, as well as evidence that they were actually implemented as prescribed. Failure to document those pieces of information position a district in very tenuous waters for using MTSS logic for eligibility decision making. Questions or comments about the tiered levels of support and or fidelity? And please, I don't want to get into which intervention is better or not. That's not really our purpose here. But any questions specifically about documenting that evidence? Okay, all right. So we will get to the student's level a little bit later on, but I wanted to underscore the importance of documenting the tiered supports as well as evidence that those tiered supports were in fact provided. So what I'd like you to do is very, very quickly, because we're running a little short on time here, we're just short of an hour, but maybe just give you a couple of moments. I would invite you to pull out your third piece of information that was provided in your packet. That is the evaluation report discussion. And what I'd like you to do is just very quickly, just 2 or 3 minutes, either with your team members or if you are here solo, then you get to do it on your own. Consider some of those first guiding questions regarding the adequacy of tiered interventions and assessments, and whether or not additional data are needed or infrastructure needs. So just consider those first 4 checkmarked items and jot a few comments down. There won't be any reporting out, but just spend 2 or 3 minutes doing that at this point. Okay, we're going to continue. Again, I fully appreciate that that was insufficient time for you to discuss amongst your teammates, but at minimum, I hope it started the conversation so that you can take this back to your teams at the district and or building level and continue these conversations. So we have just a shade over 1 hour left, and so we are going to spend the majority of that last hour, talking about the second criterion associated with identification of SLD. So the first one, just to review, was proficiency level, static. How is the student doing at this point in time after tiered supports have been delivered with integrity? The second criterion relates to, within an MTSS logic, it relates to rate of improvement. So if you are a school or a district that uses MTSS for SLD determination, you are focusing very specifically on the bottom third of this box in the visual representation, and that is a lack of progress to scientifically based instruction. If you are not approved for utilization of MTSS MTSS for SLD determination, then your current practices for SLD determination are nestled in the top 2/3 of this box. That is that is largely going to be a severe discrepancy between IQ and achievement. But since we are here today to talk about how you use MTSS for SLD determination, we focus on the second way, the bottom third of this particular box. How do we represent either adequate or inadequate responsiveness to tiered supports? And that fundamentally rests with this particular question. A student's rate of improvement, is that either too slow or is it good enough? That's fundamentally the question. How slow is too slow, which would trigger a response to this second criterion that the student is not profiting from evidence-based tiered supports. So of course, in order to do this, we need rate of improvement. We need lots of progress monitoring data. It has to be gathered or garnered from a very strong, psychometrically sound product. And again, in this day and age, there really is no excuse for using anything but a sound, psychometrically sound product, that you are using it repeatedly. And as was reflected in my comment to the question a few moments ago, minimally every week, and ideally, especially as you're working your way up through the very advanced tiers of support, consider more than once a week. And these measures ought to be brief and measuring the specific skill that you want, or that is the specific skill under which you have a concern. So high quality progress monitoring probes, largely speaking, are characterized by these core features, and I'm just going to breeze through them really quickly because there are other trainings and other resources that can dive into this a lot more deeply than we have time for today. But specifically, your progress monitoring probes must be tied directly to the academic outcome that is relevant. Reading skills, math skills, fluency in either or both, more complex skills such as reading comprehension, mathematics, application, and things like that. It should be a formative set of measures. In other words, they are equivalent measures. Equivalent here meaning they are about the same in terms of difficulty. So they are given multiple assessments. Each is a slightly different but yet still equivalent measure. You're providing them for the student at a regular basis, minimally every week. And again, as you approach Tier 3 and are moving in the direction of consideration of SLD determination, we would argue for more than once a week assessments. They ought to be relatively easy to implement and take a very short period of time so that you're not wasting valuable instructional time assessing the student on a regular basis. And then these measures ought to be sensitive to small changes in performance over time. Thankfully, most of the products that are presently available meet all of these criteria. And also, even if you are not going to be using progress monitoring data for SLD determination, minimally those progress monitoring data ought to be highly valuable as it relates to making instructional decisions about kids. But since we are talking about using SLD or using MTSS logic for SLD determination today, we're going to focus not necessarily so much on making instructional decisions and much more on using those progress monitoring data to evaluate slope. Slope is just another way of describing growth or rate of improvement. And the more data you have, the stronger you can rest on your decisions about whether the slope or rate of improvement is reliable and valid for interpretation. So what we're doing when it comes to slope is we're actually calculating a couple of different rates of improvement. And this is highlighted in the last point on this particular slide. You're going to be calculating both the expected rate of improvement or the inspected growth, and comparing that to the actual rate of improvement, or the sometimes referred to as the obtained rate of improvement for a particular student. And so you ultimately are comparing the expected or the target rate of improvement, that is what you would hope the student is, or how the student is growing, and comparing that to their actual or attained rate of improvement. In order to do that, again, you're calculating two types of rate of improvement. Expected versus the obtained. So that being said, just to clarify, we're evaluating rate of improvement through a number of different lenses. The first is what is commonly referred to as benchmark rate of improvement. Benchmark ROI is the typical rate of improvement for typical kids. Oftentimes, benchmark ROI data are calculated based upon the triannual screeners. So fall to winter, winter to spring. That is how we typically evaluate or establish benchmark or typical rate of improvement. What you are doing within an MTSS service delivery and eligibility model is taking progress monitoring data, that is weekly and or regularly scheduled progress monitoring assessment data, and calculating trends relative to the targeted student performance as well as the attained. And I know I'm batting around some terminology here that might not be helpful right at this point, but let's take a look at this graphic representation of what I mean by these different types of rate of improvement. So first, let me orient you to these data. These are oral reading fluency data for a particular student, and the very top line represents typical rate of improvement. That is the triannual benchmarks, fall, winter, and spring. So in fall, the typical student or the benchmark student is reading 52 correct words per minute. In winter, the typical student is reading 72 correct words per minute. And then in spring, the typical student is reading 87 correct words per minute. The solid line connecting those three data points represents typical or benchmark rate of improvement. That is, and just so you know how I'm doing the calculations, they're on the next slide. But going back to the visual, the typical rate of improvement or benchmark rate of improvement is calculated by taking the spring benchmark of 87 and subtracting it from the fall benchmark of 52 and dividing it by 36 weeks. 36 weeks is generally regarded as the typical length in terms of weeks for a typical school. When we take 87 minus 52 and divide it by 36, we get 0.97 words correct per minute per week. That is the typical or benchmark rate of improvement. So the typical kid is on average gaining approximately 1 word correct per minute per week. Questions on typical or benchmark ROI? Okay. Then let's look at our particular student. And by the way, these are not necessarily the student reflected in the ER. Actually, these aren't. These are different data. So for this particular student, at the beginning of this academic year, the student was performing at 20 words correct per minute. That is evident by the lowest data point for the fall benchmark. So the student was at 20 in the fall. At the end of the year, the student was at 50. The solid line connecting 20 to 37 to 50 is the actual or the attained rate of improvement for the student. The annual attained rate of improvement for that student is calculated by taking 50, that's the ending point, subtracting it from 20, or subtracting 20 from it, that is the fall benchmark assessment, and dividing by the standard 36 weeks of instructional time. When we do that, we get an attained rate of improvement of 0.83 words correct per minute. So that is what the student actually obtained. Any questions on the actual rate of improvement or attained rate of improvement for this student? Okay. You may be wondering, what the heck is that dashed line? The dashed line was our targeted rate of improvement for the student. Targeted rate of improvement in this context means the rate of improvement that a student, this student in particular, would have to achieve over the course of the academic year to catch up. Because notably in fall, the student was 32 words correct per minute discrepant from typical. And if we want the student to catch up, the student, in order to catch up, would have to go from 20 in fall and reach 87 words correct per minute by the spring. And in order to catch up or achieve 87 correct words per minute, this student, would have to have a rate of improvement of 1.86 words correct per minute. that 1.86 is represented by the dashed line. And the dashed line was calculated by taking the desired ending point of 87, subtracting from it the starting point for this student, which was 20, and dividing that by 36 weeks. In doing so, the targeted rate of improvement for this student is 1.86. So if we want to help this student close the level gap by the end of the year, the student must have a rate of improvement that hovers around 1.86 words correct per minute for the duration of the school year. Notice, however, that that was what the target was, but for this student, the actual or attained rate of improvement, as represented by the lower solid line, was much less steep, or was flatter, than the targeted rate of improvement. So we'll talk about how slow is slow in just a moment, but I wanted to orient you to those three key concepts. Typical or benchmark rate of improvement, that is what the typical kid does over the course of the academic year. Attained rate of improvement, which is what the kid actually did. And then targeted rate of improvement is what we hope the kid achieves in order to close the gap. And three very different calculations for those three different rates of improvement. Any questions on those three rates of improvement? Okay, being none, then we will move on. So this subsequent slide just hopefully, if I did my job well, operationalizes how at least the typical or benchmark ROI was calculated, and you would then use that same formula to calculate the targeted rate of improvement, which was where the kid started and where we want the kid to end at the end of the year, which is achieving at the same rate, or the same level as typical, and then the actual rate of improvement, which is what the student obtained. Okay, so progress monitoring facilitates a process by which we can evaluate the degree with which the attained rate of improvement is disparate or similar to the targeted rate of improvement. In other words, how well did the student actually obtain a rate of improvement that would close the gap? And that, very frankly, is the specific question that we must address in the second criterion for using MTSS logic for SLD determination. Okay. So the good news is that you typically don't have to do those calculations that I just went through if you're using most standard, high-quality, commercially available products. So AimsWeb, FAST, STAR, the MAP, other typically used commercially available products across the Commonwealth will provide rate of improvement data for you automatically. But it's important that you at least understand how those calculations are derived so that you are not just following what the product produces without really understanding what it means. Notably, Dibbles Next, unfortunately, currently does not offer ROI data. So if you are a district that is using or is considering using Dibbles Next, you would have to export those data, those progress monitoring data, into another system and then calculate ROI. Notably, the two that we would recommend would be ChartDog, and there's a website for it. I use ChartDog all the time. It's free, by the way, so that's great. So ChartDog is an excellent tool, and it gives you wonderfully visually accurate graphs. Or you can also use Excel. I am an Excel nerd. I love Excel. I collect Excel data on my own teaching practices and actually on my family, and they get freaked out by that. But anyhow, I probably just shared a little too much, but I love Excel. So I think Excel is fantastic, but I know many people are averse to using Excel. But there is a wonderful website that was designed and maintained by some of our esteemed colleagues across the Commonwealth, Caitlin Benioff, Matt Furchuk, and Andy McRae, who have developed rateofimprovement.com. That is a website that has lots of useful Excel tools and tutorials that can benefit those districts or schools that use a commercially available product such as Dibbles Next that does not immediately offer ROI data. but you have to be able to calculate ROI in some capacity in order to use MTSS logic for SLD determination. Here's an important point. If you are having to export your data and are using either ChartDog or Excel, if you are using a commercially available product, you can tune me out for a couple of moments. But if you are not, and instead you're using Excel, this is actually very important. And that is, if you're using Excel, the default in Excel spreadsheets assumes equal intervals between your progress monitoring data that you collected. In other words, it assumes you did it on the exact same day every single week. And all of you who are in schools, you can appreciate that sometimes things don't go as planned, correct? So if the original plan is to have to progress monitor every Friday morning, and then you hit this Friday morning where you have 2-hour delays in many schools, you might miss the opportunity to progress monitor a kid on a Friday, and instead you do it next Monday. If you are not aware of how Excel operates, you could very easily inadvertently miscalculate ROI using Excel, because Excel by default assumes that the intervals between progress monitoring data are the same. And colleagues of ours across the state and I, we use some data to demonstrate how if you aren't sensitive to that default setting in Excel, Excel will calculate ROIs that are wildly incorrect and will lead you to make very inappropriate, potentially inappropriate decisions about ROI and a student's growth. So the caution here is that if you're using Excel, and in ChartDog, the default actually already does this, but if you're using Excel, make sure you're listing in your Excel spreadsheet the actual date of administration, because Excel will then calculate an ROI that is sensitive to the differing intervals between assessment days. And that is typically how schools work, right? You don't always do your assessment on the same day. Ideally, you do that, but not always does that happen in reality. So it is absolutely critical that you, if using Excel, are indicating in the Excel file the precise date of administration for each one of your CBM, or each one of your progress monitoring probes, in order to obtain a reliable and valid ROI using Excel. Okay. Those of you who don't use Excel, or your district will not be using it because you have other tools, I invite you to tune me back in because we've done a little quick disclaimer. So this is somewhat related to the comment earlier from our audience that you need lots of data points in order to have a sufficiently psychometrically sound rate of improvement to make decisions. If you are talking about movement among or within tiers, 4 to 8 data points is probably adequate. However, when it comes to making an eligibility decision, this is a much higher stake decision, is it not? We're talking about whether a kid has a disability or not. That is a very high stakes decision. Consequently, having 4 or 6 or maybe even 8 data points to calculate an ROI, which is then used to say whether or not a kid has a disability, is probably not enough data. And instead, we need to make sure that we have a robust amount of data in order to make those high stakes decisions. This is true for reading and is even much more so the case for math and written expression. What we do know from the literature in reading and progress monitoring in reading is that you probably need anywhere from 10 to 12 to maybe even 14 data points before making a high stakes decision about eligibility for special ed, which is different than the number of data points you would need in order to make instructional decisions and decisions about movement within and amongst the tiers. Think about that. For oral reading fluency, which is, the gold standard, right, of progress monitoring. We've known about oral reading fluency for like 40 years. The literature is very clear that even under ideal testing conditions, when you're making a decision about eligibility for special education using oral reading fluency probes, you probably need 10 to 12 at a minimum data points. So if you're doing it every week, that's a long period of time. If you're doing it twice a week, your time is cut in half. But it gives you more data and much more data to reliably estimate their rate of improvement. And when we're talking about an eligibility decision process, which is a high stakes, you want to be absolutely certain that your data are highly reliable and highly valid. Consequently, you need lots of data. So that speaks to these issues related to progress monitoring. If you are gearing up for using progress monitoring data to establish ROI, which is then used for eligibility decision making, make sure that you're administering them under ideal conditions. You're administering them on a very rigorous schedule, at least once a week, if not twice a week. And ideally, you're administering, in particular, oral reading fluency, you're administering 3 probes and you're taking the median. Under those ideal conditions, then 10, 12, 14 data points is sufficient for reliably establishing rate of improvement used for a very high decision such as eligibility for special ed. Again, which is different than how many data points you need for movement amongst the tiers, and also the testing conditions for establishing ROI when making those instructional decisions for tiered supports. Okay, and there is a summary of basically what I just said. For those who are nerdy like me and want to find out whether or not what I'm saying is truthful, there are some reference. Ted, Chris, Scott, Arderwin, and others have provided lots of evidentiary support for the statements that I just made about how many data points and under what testing conditions are ideal for making high stakes decisions about special education eligibility. Just a few finer points about ROI is a recognition that the methods by which benchmarks are established by different products is different. So, for example, one product may establish their benchmark at the 50th percentile rank, another one may establish it at the 40th. Still another one may peg it to the 35th percentile rank. So the way your product establishes benchmark is not necessarily the same as another product. So please understand that, which again is yet another reason why we want to stress that you are using your product's normative information to make decisions about level and rate of improvement. Similarly, it is important to recognize that growth rates are not linear. It's not a straight line from fall to spring. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that clearly documents that growth in fall to winter is much steeper than it is from winter to spring. There is somewhat of a plateauing effect from winter to spring. And if we had more time, we could possibly go into why that is evident in the data. But for our purposes here today, just understand that growth is not necessarily linear across the entire year. It's actually somewhat what is referred to curvilinear, meaning it's steeper in the first half of the year, and then it somewhat flattens out a little bit in the second half of the year. Consequently, it might be wise to calculate rate of improvement, not only benchmark rate of improvement, but also target and attained rate of improvement based upon half years, which is different than what I just showed you a few slides ago. That was for the whole year, but most products will calculate semester or half-year rates of improvement as well. And we would strongly recommend that you take those half-year rates of improvement into consideration, again, given what we know about the curvilinear or non-linear relationship of rate of improvement as a whole across all kids. All right. So the question then functionally becomes, what is too slow? And the way we do that is one of two ways. Either you're comparing the student's actual rate of improvement or their attained rate of improvement to the typical rate of improvement or benchmark, which is the first item, or the second one, which really relates to the attained or actual rate of improvement for a student based upon the rate of improvement of other students who already were at that same level to begin with, which is a fine point to please understand. The first one is comparing my student to every other student who is typical in those two different rates of improvement. The second one really is looking at how is this student's rate of improvement compared to other students who were basically at the same level to begin with. The second point here factors in the beginning performance of the student and really is comparing this student to same level peers. In other words, peers that were approximately at the same level to start with. The first one really is comparing a student to the typical student, which is not necessarily a student who is functioning at the same level to begin with. So unfortunately, this second criterion for SLD determination specific to rate of improvement lacks consensus in the empirical literature and also lacks consensus in the field as to how to go about doing that. So consequently, it is up to each individual LEA and building to determine the criteria for establishment of deficient rate of improvement. So sadly, I'm not going to tell you how Patton, IU, or PDE wants you to operationalize what is too slow. What I will instead is offer some illustrations of how one or how a district might go about doing this. So, in order to typically establish how slow is too slow, you must answer basically two questions. What is an acceptable level of proficiency by the end of tiered supports? And what is a reasonable amount of time? So the first question is, again, where do you want a student to be at the end of a period of time? So what is the expected level of proficiency by the end of tiered supports? The second question relates to how long are you willing to sustain the levels of supports needed to achieve that eventual level that you are targeting? So, that first question, what is an acceptable level of proficiency? Well, one illustration could be pegging expected level of proficiency to be at the 50th percentile rank, but it could also be the 25th or the 35th. Another example would be that if a district says that adequate level is 25th percentile, then that should be our target for any student who is in tiered support, is to move at least to the 25th percentile rank. Fundamentally, a district and a building must decide in advance what is the minimum level that we want a student to achieve by the end of tiered supports when we're considering SLD determination. What do we minimally want them to be at by the time tiered supports are exhausted? The second question focuses on, okay, how long are we willing to try tiered supports in order to help that student achieve the targeted level? This is not an easy question to answer, and frankly, and unfortunately, is somewhat contingent upon the resources in a school district and in a building. This is not an easy one to grapple with, certainly by any stretch of the imagination. But this is critical, because if a district is able to adequately support highly individualized Tier 3 supports for multiple months, and if the parents are fully informed of that and the parents are in agreement with that, then it is very reasonable to suggest that maybe we keep a student in Tier 3 supports for up to a year, allowing that student the opportunity to close the gap or to achieve that targeted level even after a year of highly individualized Tier 3 supports. But at the same time, another district maybe is unable to provide that level of support for that period of time. That is a difficult question, but one that must be wrestled with by particular districts and buildings relative to a reasonable amount of time to wait until a student has achieved the targeted level. So one way we can establish how long will it be until the child actually closes the gap is to conduct what we refer to as ROI trajectories, or projections into the future. And this is a way in which we can establish just how long it's going to take, given current rate of improvement, for the student to close the gap. It's a graphic representation of essentially how long do we have to wait until a student is at a desired level of proficiency. So basically what we do here is compare a student's current rate of improvement with how long it will be, given their current rate of improvement, until they close the gap. And that then facilitates conversations about whether there are adequate resources available to sustain the current levels of support in order to help a student close the gap. So in order to do that, we need to establish our accepted level of proficiency by the end of a period of time. So whether that's 25th, 40th, 35th, 50th, whatever, that is district established. Then we calculate the needed rate of improvement, or the targeted rate of improvement, between where the student is right now and where we want the student to be. And you compare that needed ROI to their actual or attained ROI. And then have that conversation about how disparate, how different are those two rates of improvement, and can we sustain the current rate of improvement given resource allocations. So the calculation of these is done the same way as we just walked through a little while ago, with the exception of, instead of plugging in the end of the year benchmark score in the numerator, you're instead plugging in what is the targeted level of minimum performance that would indicate this student is no longer having substantial problems. And you're subtracting from it their current level of performance and dividing that by the number of weeks of instruction. And when we look at these ROI trajectories, we are considering longer periods of time, such as how far will the student progress in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. You can even look at half years. And as a consequence, your denominator in your calculation is contingent upon the amount of time you are willing to allow a student to sustain within a tiered level of support before considering SLD eligibility. So here is an example of some data, again, not reflective of the ER illustration that has been provided in your materials. But let's say we have a 4th grade student, and these are norms data from Hasbrook and Tyndall, so these are a little bit antiquated, but don't worry about that. It's really just a function of here just having you see how this is actually done. So within this particular illustration that spans across a couple of slides, we are looking at a student who is currently half of where he or she needs to be. That is the 50th percent of level. So that's that middle row in this table. And so if we are saying that the student is currently at the 50th or half of level, and we want the student to eventually be at the 50th percentile rank, that's the 50th target percentile, then the rates of improvement that are required in 1 year is 1.97 to close the gap within a year, or over a 2-year span, a rate of improvement equivalent to 1.17, correct words per minute. So how did I get all of that? Well, here's how we did it. We take the student's current level of 56 words correct per minute, which is half of the level of proficiency, and the school pegged proficiency at the 50th percentile rank, so got to close the gap to the 50th percentile rank, and it's going to take an ROI of nearly 2 words correct per minute over the course of an entire year to close the gap. In order to close that same gap, but over a 2-year period of time, notice the rate of improvement is a little bit lower at 1.17 words correct per minute. The student's current rate of improvement is 1.52. So it's hovering in between the ROI needed to close the gap in 1 year versus the ROI needed to close the gap in 2 years. So these data would suggest that the current ROI for this student would take about 1.5 years for the student to close the gap. The question then becomes, can you sustain the level of supports for 1.5 years in order for the student to close the gap and reach a level of proficiency that is sufficient? And that's not a question that I can answer. It's a question that buildings would have to wrestle with. Here is that same set of data illustrated visually. So just to orient you, the solid line that is trending upward that connects multiple data points represents the benchmark or typical rate of improvement for students at the 50th percentile rank. The dashed line that is somewhat parallel to it below represents the benchmark or typical rate of improvement for kids who are performing at the 25th percentile rank nationally. Our student in question has a data point in 4th grade that is presently at 56. So you can see that represented there. 56 correct words per minute. The different arrays that stem from that student's data point in grade 4 at the winter benchmark represent the various rates of improvement that are needed to achieve either the 50th percentile rank of proficiency or the 25th percentile rank level of proficiency. So the rates of improvement needed to achieve the 50th percentile rank are the solid lines that are labeled ROI and then some number. So the ROI for closing the gap from current level to the 50th percentile rank in grade 5 is the steepest ROI, and that is an ROI of 1.97. I'm going to go backwards a bit. There it is. 1.97. So in order to close the gap, the student would have to achieve an ROI that is sustained for approximately 1 year of 2 words correct per minute of improvement. If a district and a building can sustain that level of support over a 2-year span, then the ROI for that student would only need to be 1.17 words correct per minute. That is the second steepest solid ROI line. And then so forth. The third, I guess, less steep, or the ROI of 0.74 is the ROI that would be needed to close the gap over a 3-year span. The dashed ROIs represent the ROIs needed to not close the gap to the 50th percentile rank, but instead close the gap to the 25th percentile rank. So you can see why it's important that districts and buildings pre-establish what is the threshold for proficiency when calculating the attained and the targeted ROI for students in these projection analyses. So it's a lot of lines, a lot of numbers, and a lot of verbiage. I'm going to pause to see if there are questions related to this particular content.
We do have a question out of Harrisburg.
Okay, great.
If there is a parent request for an evaluation, how does the team proceed using RTI methods, and what would be the timeline?
So if there's a good question. So if a parent has submitted a request for an evaluation and they have signed the permission to evaluate, then absolutely you are legally obligated to complete the evaluation within 60 calendar days, with the exception of summer breaks. So you have 60 calendar days, so you would absolutely want to proceed with that process. But at the same time and concurrently, I would strongly recommend that you continue to allow the tiered support structure to play out and gather as much data as you can, and then no later than 60 calendar days after that parent has signed the permission to evaluate, look at all of your data including your progress monitoring data, your fidelity data of the tiered supports, as well as whatever other additional data were collected. And I'm going to guess the question stems from perhaps maybe regard to the more traditional school psyche types of evaluative data, such as standardized, norm referenced, IQ and achievement measures, and look at the totality of those data. But absolutely, if a parent puts a request in writing and it's signed on a fully informed permission to evaluate, you have to follow the 60 calendar day rule, but still continue with the RTI process.
Thank you.
Very good question. I'm sure I probably didn't answer it thoroughly, but at least I tried to minimally remind everybody of your federal obligation for child fine and compliance with parental requests for evaluations. Okay, so if the student's current ROI, as represented by this green line, is 1.52, we can see that if we are projecting into the future, it'll take about 1.5 years before the student catches up. So the question then becomes, does the building have the resources to sustain current supports for 1.5 years? Similarly, the question should also be, are parents fully on board with this? Because if parents say, no, I want to evaluate my kid, I don't want to wait 1.5 years, then it triggers, I think, what was just expressed in that question. Okay, parents request an evaluation, we have to honor that request. But we have this very important question that we have to wrestle with regard to, can we wait 1.5 years with the same level of supports afforded to the student? Because if we can close the gap. And you know what? We can close the gap without special education services. And nothing against special ed. I obviously come from the world of special ed, but that's a good thing if we can prevent a student from being placed in special education and maintain that least restrictive environment while still affording sufficient progress. That is absolutely critical, and that is the benefit of using MTSS not only for service delivery, but for eligibility decision making. Of course, if we have, say, for example, ROI of 0.4, which is not reflected in this actual student or in this student's actual data, but you could very obviously see if you're graphing these data, if you got a kid with an ROI 0.4 and you're projecting out, you're saying, we may not even achieve the 25th percentile rank in 4 years. That's a problem. That would probably suggest that if you've run out of tiered supports, this kid whose ROI, attained ROI, is in red, probably would be eligible for special education because you've exhausted all of your tiered supports, you have evidence to indicate that they were implemented with integrity, and your trajectory analysis says it's going to take many, many years for this kid to maybe catch up, and we just can't sustain those supports. And frankly, it's probably a disservice to the kid to wait that long and not consider eligibility for special education. So your trajectory analyses, I hope, or we hope, are incredibly beneficial for helping you establish what is an adequate level of ROI when making decisions about eligibility for special ed, because again, that is the second criterion in our 4 criteria for special education eligibility under the SLD category. We don't have time for turn and talk. I apologize because I do want to get back into our example ER. So we're going to skip over actually quite a bit here so that we can get to our dive into the evaluation report. And I, again, apologize for having to skip over a bit of content, but I did want to provide an opportunity to revisit our ER. And if we had more time, I'd actually invite you to take some time amongst yourselves and within your groups to actually look at and digest all of the information that is contained within our sample ER with respect to eligibility decision making, but we don't, so this is going to be a much more structured and much more I do approach than it is we do or even you do approach. So I'm going to invite you to turn back into your evaluation reports, and we're going to skip ahead. You're going to notice that these graphs for progress monitoring appear twice in the ER. So there are actually 4 graphs, but they really are only 2 graphs that are duplicated a second time later on. And that is largely a function or a product of the ER format. So I invite you to turn to page 14. So go to page 14 of the ER. And for those who are maybe not as familiar with the ER template, starting on page 14 are the series of questions that MDTs must answer with regard to using data to inform SLD determination. And specifically, I draw your attention to near the, I guess, the top third of page 14, the district itself, and I'm going to highlight it here, the district itself has established in advance what it considers to be the criterion for deficient level, which is criterion 1, as well as deficient rate of improvement, which is criterion 2. And this ER very explicitly lists that. So, as you're looking at it, I will just highlight what the district has established. The district has established that deficient level is represented by a performance indicator of a percentile rank at or below the 10th percentile rank. So that's first criterion. So in other words, the kid's last progress monitoring data point, and frankly, all the data leading up to it, should be suggestive of performance that is at or below the 10th percentile rank. So that's level. That's how the district has operationalized deficient level. The district has also, relative to criterion 2, established inadequate growth as eventual or ending point level at the 25th percentile rank. So they have established in advance that rate of improvement is pegged to a target that reaches the 25th percentile rank. So level has to be below 10th percentile rank, and rate of improvement must be indicative of achieving the 25th percentile rank in a reasonable amount of time. So those two pieces are absolutely critical data to understand as to how this district has operationalized criterion 1 and criterion 2. These are what this district uses. Please do not just simply take these and apply them to your own district. Districts have the flexibility, and we encourage the flexibility to decide what is most relevant for you as a district, and we would strongly recommend that you make a very thoughtful decision about both of those criterion and really rely on your local expertise, involvement of your IU and your patent consultants as well, because they all collectively, in addition to your local expertise, can guide you very, very well. Okay, so now let's take a look at, moving down to page 15, these are the data for Jane over the course of an entire academic year relative to nonsense word fluency. So one of our phonics indicators for this particular student. Let me just orient you to this particular graph. I guess that's yellow. I apologize, I'm a little bit colorblind, so to me that is yellow. The yellow line represents the typical or benchmark performance, pegged for DIBELS Next, which is the tool that this district is using. So, bless you, the 3 times a year triennial data points and then the rate of improvement. So the typical rate of improvement, by the way, per day is 0.1169. That's the slope of this regression line. In order to get a per week rate of improvement, you have to take the slope and multiply it by 7. Thankfully, that has been done for you right down here in the subsequent table, where the benchmark rate of improvement, as noted here, is 0.82. How do we get 0.82? We got 0.82 by taking this slope of the regression line, 0.1169, and multiplied it by 7. For a later point in time, after you have returned to your offices and you forgot how we calculated it, There it is in the note. The conversion of a metric to correct words per week requires multiplying the slope by 7 to get the weekly growth. So the benchmark or typical rate of improvement is 0.82. This district, remember I said the district wants their students to achieve the 25th percentile rank by the end of the year. So that would be the targeted rate of improvement for Jane, starting out at 15 ROI, 15 or reading fluency correct words per minute, achieving the 25th percentile rank for Dibbles Next in second grade. That is pegged at 48 correct words per minute. So we want Jane to progress along this green dashed line. That is the aim line. The slope is 0.124. Remember, to calculate a weekly rate of improvement, we have to take that number and multiply it by 7. When you do that, you get a weekly rate of improvement that is her targeted rate of improvement of 0.87. And these are, I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier, these are correct letter sounds, not words correct per minute. These are letter sounds. When we look at Jane's actual rate of improvement as represented by the blue dashed line, again, we get a rate of improvement that is indicated right here. We have to take that number and multiply it by 7 because we're using Excel. And Excel, recall, gives you a daily rate of improvement. When we take that number and multiply it by 7, we get a rate of improvement, an actual or attained rate of improvement of 0.25. So when we assess these data, what this tells us is that the typical kid is improving by 0.82 correct letter sounds per week. Jane needed to achieve this level in order to close the gap. But this is what Jane actually improved by per week in terms of correct letter sounds. Okay? If we move down to the bottom of that page, and then on the next page as well, where the tabular data are presented, here are data relative to oral reading fluency, correct words per minute. And I apologize, wow, we have a mislabeled y-axis, so I apologize for that. It should say correct words per minute. So that's an error that we will correct for the future. And what we have here are, again, here's the typical rate of improvement. Now, notably, in second grade, oral reading fluency is initially assessed in winter. It's not assessed in fall, so that's why we start in winter. And then here is Jane's performance. Jane's performance, her actual performance was at 9 in winter. And in order to achieve the 25th percentile rank by the end of the year, she needed a rate of improvement here. But here is her actual rate of improvement as represented by the blue. And here is her actual rate of improvement. When those three slopes are multiplied by 7, they are then presented in the table in terms of what the typical kid's rate of improvement is from winter to spring. 1.27 correct words per minute from winter to spring versus what she needed to attain, her targeted or aim line, which is 1.22, and what she actually achieved, which was 0.38. And my mouse all of a sudden stopped working. So, okay, that's funny. There we go. So her attained rate of improvement is 0.38. So in conclusion, and this is no small matter in terms of the ER, here are the concluding data that the district presents and uses as justification to satisfy criterion 1, which is level, and criterion 2, which is rate of improvement. Jane's nonsense word fluency and oral reading fluency both were below the 10th percentile rank based on spring first grade benchmarks and corroborated by her progress monitoring data. In other words, all those data, especially the data toward the end of the academic year, clearly were well below the 10th percentile rank, which is what the district pre-established as being deficient in level. The second piece, second criterion for SLD determination, how was her rate of improvement? Well, the district did rate of improvement discrepancy analysis looking at what was her necessary or targeted rate of improvement and dividing that by what was her actual rate of improvement, and you get basically a discrepancy related to her performance. And in regard to oral reading fluency, Jane's oral reading fluency was actually 0.38 correct words per minute, but she needed 1.22, and that means that her attained rate of improvement is over 3 times discrepant than what she actually needed. And that, according to this district's criterion, is an indication that her rate of improvement is insufficient. That was a lot. And I realize we have 4 minutes for questions, which is absolutely inadequate. But any big questions that are in people's minds?
Remember, after you leave here, if you have questions, please send them to Jeannie Hertzler, myself, Silke Caparelli, or anyone on the MTSS initiative, whether you're in this region, Harrisburg, or East, so that we can be sure to respond to the questions that you have. Any immediate questions for Dr. Runge?
There's got to be questions, but I think people are just kind of glossed over a bit. I apologize if my instruction was insufficient. This is Tier 1 instruction that you're getting on using RTI MTSS logic. I would encourage you to not just go back and suggest that my Tier 1 instruction was adequate. I'm a realist and understand that this instruction, I take the ecological approach in everything I do in life, is probably insufficient for most, if not all of you.
Can we have 2 takeaways? Are there 2 takeaways here that you're going, wait, that is really awesome, I didn't know that?
Yep.
Here's one.
Yeah.
I think my biggest takeaway is just whenever you started talking about the ROIs and thinking about ROIs, like how long, like how fast are they going to have to grow, in a year or in 2 years in order, like that was a big takeaway for me because I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and unfortunately the decision about do we have enough resources to sustain that is a local decision, and there comes with that some challenges, of course. But that is important to really wrestle with. Thank you.
Something for us to take away to gen ed teachers when they say, oh, he's improving. Yes, but he's improving this much.
Yep.
When he should in fact be improving this much.
Yes, absolutely.
So it leads to more of the understanding that there could absolutely be a need for special ed.
And I would also hope, and you didn't suggest this in your comments, but I feel obligated to at least say this very publicly. This is not a reflection of the quality of you as a teacher. It's a reflection of the MTSS system as well as the match or mismatch with a student's needs. So this is never intended to evaluate you as a teacher or you and your peers as teachers. It's intended to really evaluate the strength of the MTSS system to appropriately match and meet the needs of the student. And sometimes there are kids whose needs are so significant that they require special education services, and that's okay. But this allows us to weed or tease those issues out. Okay, thank you for the 2 takeaways. Again, this is Tier 1 instruction. This is not easy stuff. This is not for the faint of heart. I've been doing this stuff for like 20 years, and I still learn stuff all the time. So I would encourage you to seek out Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction and support via your patent consultants, your IU consultants, your colleagues across the state, reputable internet resources that we have provided toward the end of your handouts here. Just be leery of anything that isn't necessarily known to your colleagues or your IU or patent consultants. And this is an ongoing process, so we would encourage you to keep seeking out professional development, because just coming to a 3-hour workshop is grossly inadequate, even if I really was a good instructor, and I'm not so sure about that comment. So I leave it up to you to continue in your development in those regards.
I think you did wonderful. We have a few changes that we'd like to make for March. If you have recommendations, please put them in your review. Yes. Take time right now to fill those out. Remember, the session is offered again in March. There's other MTSS supporting sessions for your consumption. Please look at your patent calendar. We're here afterwards right now if you have additional questions. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the morning and a great afternoon.
Thank you.